The loudest people in a property dispute are almost never the ones who actually own the land. The crisp scent of ripe Honeycrisp apples drifted through the cool October air as I reached for another branch with my pruning shears, the metallic click echoing softly beneath a cloudless Texas sky. Morning dew still clung to the grass around my boots, and somewhere beyond the rows of trees, a tractor hummed its familiar tune, steady and reassuring. The same sound that had greeted 3 generations of my family every harvest season. My name is Ethan Calloway, and if you had driven past my orchard that morning, you probably would have thought you were looking at the quietest place in the county. You would have been wrong. The first police cruiser rolled onto the gravel lane so fast that loose stones rattled against my pickup. A second cruiser followed, then a third. Blue lights flashed silently beneath the branches while curious homeowners gathered behind the white vinyl fence bordering the neighboring subdivision. Several of them already had their phones raised, eager to record whatever spectacle they believed was about to unfold. I slowly placed my pruning shears on the tailgate instead of in my pocket. Experience had taught me that calm always outlasted panic. Before either officer reached me, I heard the sharp click of expensive heels on packed dirt. Victoria Harrington, president of the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, marched toward me wearing an immaculate cream-colored blazer that somehow looked untouched by the orchard dust swirling around her. Her oversized sunglasses reflected rows of apple trees she clearly considered her own. She pointed directly at me without even saying good morning. "That's him, officers," she announced loudly enough for everyone behind the fence to hear. "He's trespassing on HOA property again." The statement hung in the cool air almost as strangely as the sweet smell of fresh cider drifting from my processing barn. One of the younger officers looked from her to me with obvious uncertainty. The older deputy removed his sunglasses and quietly studied the weathered wooden sign near the entrance that simply read, "Calloway Orchard, established 1948. I smiled politely. "Morning, deputy." Victoria folded her arms, clearly irritated that I wasn't arguing. "Don't play innocent," she snapped. "You've ignored every notice we've sent. This orchard belongs to the community now. Our residents have every legal right to enjoy this space, and you have no authority to keep them out." Behind her, several homeowners nodded with complete confidence. Some carried picnic baskets. One family had bicycles. A little boy pointed excitedly toward the pumpkin patch as though admission had already been approved. None of them realized they had walked onto private property because someone else had convinced them it was common land. I looked across the fence toward the perfectly lined streets of Willow Ridge Estates. Identical mailboxes, identical roofs, identical landscaping. Every house sitting peacefully beneath mature oak trees planted decades before the subdivision even existed. My grandfather used to call that hill the Western Pasture long before developers ever imagined cul-de-sacs there. The deputy cleared his throat. "Sir, she says you've been refusing HOA access to this orchard." I nodded once. "That's correct." Victoria smiled triumphantly, convinced the admission settled everything. "See? He's intentionally violating HOA policy." I could almost hear the whispers spreading through the crowd. They expected handcuffs. They expected an angry confrontation. They expected another stubborn farmer refusing to follow neighborhood rules. What they didn't expect was that I never once denied keeping them out. Because there was one detail Victoria Harrington had somehow overlooked before calling the sheriff's department, before threatening lawsuits, before printing hundreds of HOA newsletters claiming this orchard belonged to her subdivision. The land beneath every single one of those beautiful homes, the roads, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, the decorative ponds, even the office where she proudly held monthly HOA meetings, was still part of an estate my family legally owned. And by the time the morning was over, everyone standing there was about to discover that property lines don't care who talks the loudest. The deputy asked if we could step somewhere quieter, away from the growing crowd, but I simply nodded toward the weathered wooden bench beside the old equipment shed. The scent of fresh apples mixed with cedar from the barn walls while a light breeze carried the rustle of thousands of leaves overhead. Everything about the orchard felt familiar, steady, almost timeless. That calm had always been my greatest advantage because this place had taught every Calloway that rushing usually led to mistakes. My grandfather, Walter Calloway, bought the first 40 acres in 1948 with money he earned repairing tractors after returning home from the war. He planted the original orchard one tree at a time, often working until the moon rose over the hills. My father expanded it another 60 acres, adding irrigation lines, cold storage buildings, and a small cider mill that still operated every autumn. By the time the property passed to me, the orchard was more than a business. Every fence post carried a memory. Every gravel road reminded me of riding beside my father in his faded green pickup while he explained that land was never really owned forever. You simply became responsible for protecting it until the next generation was ready. I remembered the smell of engine oil on his work gloves, the rough texture of old survey maps spread across our kitchen table, and the way he carefully rolled every deed back into its protective tube before placing it inside a steel cabinet. He used to smile whenever I asked why he kept paperwork older than anyone alive. He would tap the cabinet door and say, "Trees feed your family, Ethan, but documents protect the trees." At the time, I thought he was simply being old-fashioned. Years later, I realized he had spent decades preparing for a fight he hoped would never happen. Willow Ridge Estates did not exist when I was growing up. The hillside beyond our western fence had been open pasture where deer wandered every evening before sunset. Nearly 20 years earlier, a national development company purchased neighboring farmland and announced plans for hundreds of upscale homes, walking trails, decorative lakes, and a private clubhouse. Most local families welcomed the investment. New schools arrived. Small businesses flourished. Property values climbed. My father welcomed every new neighbor who stopped by for fresh cider during harvest season. He never acted like the subdivision was an enemy because, in his mind, good neighbors respected boundaries whether they were marked by fences or simple handshakes. After he passed away, I continued the same tradition. Families visited every fall to pick apples. Children laughed through the pumpkin patch. Teachers brought field trips. Veterans held charity breakfasts in the cider barn. The orchard became part of the community without ever becoming community property. That difference mattered more than most people realized. Victoria Harrington moved into Willow Ridge only 4 years earlier. According to nearly everyone I met, she immediately volunteered for every committee, every board meeting, and eventually the presidency of the Homeowners Association itself. At first, our conversations had been perfectly pleasant. She complimented the orchard during her first visit and even purchased 3 baskets of apples for a neighborhood festival. Looking back, I realized she spent less time admiring the trees than studying the property lines. At the time, I thought she was simply curious. I had no idea she was already imagining a future where the orchard belonged to someone else. Victoria did not try to take over the orchard all at once. Looking back, that was probably the smartest thing she ever did. Instead of making one outrageous demand, she planted small ideas that sounded perfectly reasonable if you did not know the history behind the property. It started with an email asking whether Willow Ridge residents could enjoy a monthly community picnic beneath the apple trees. I politely declined because harvest season brought tractors, equipment, and insurance concerns. She answered with a smile and thanked me for considering it. 2 weeks later, another request arrived. This time she asked if the Homeowners Association could install a small walking trail along the western edge of the orchard so residents could enjoy nature. Again, I declined, explaining that the trail would cross active farming areas and private maintenance roads. She responded just as pleasantly, at least on the surface. A month later, I noticed something strange while checking irrigation valves before sunrise. Fresh wooden stakes had appeared near my western fence line. Bright orange ribbons fluttered from them in the morning breeze, and tiny survey flags stretched through the grass toward the subdivision. I pulled one out, assuming a contractor had made an honest mistake, but by the next afternoon another set had appeared several yards farther into my property. I called the utility companies first, thinking someone might be marking underground lines. None of them had authorized the work. Then I quietly removed the new markers and went back to pruning trees. I still believed the situation could be solved with a simple conversation. That conversation came sooner than expected. Victoria arrived the following Saturday with 3 members of the Homeowners Association board, each carrying clipboards and smiling as though they had already won an argument nobody else knew was happening. She complimented the orchard before casually mentioning that Willow Ridge was planning several exciting community improvements. One proposal included seasonal walking paths through what she described as the neighborhood green space. I gently corrected her. She laughed as though I had misunderstood the project. According to her, the orchard had become such an important landmark for homeowners that everyone already viewed it as an extension of the neighborhood. Community expectations, she explained, often mattered just as much as property lines. I remember hearing bees humming around the late-blooming flowers while she said those words. It was amazing how confidently someone could redefine ownership simply because enough people believed the same story. After that meeting, little changes appeared almost every week. Professionally printed signs popped up beside the subdivision entrance advertising future orchard festivals sponsored by the Homeowners Association. Colorful newsletters appeared in residents' mailboxes inviting families to enjoy their beautiful community orchard. One weekend I arrived before sunrise to find a yoga class already setting up folding chairs beneath my oldest apple trees. The instructor apologized immediately after I explained the misunderstanding. She showed me the online advertisement. It listed my orchard as one of Willow Ridge Estate's exclusive neighborhood amenities. I took photographs instead of arguing. I saved every newsletter. I downloaded every advertisement. I archived every social media post where Victoria proudly described the orchard as shared community space. Each new claim sounded slightly bolder than the last, but I never confronted her publicly. She mistook my silence for surrender. What she did not realize was that every false statement created another piece of evidence, and every cheerful announcement brought her one step closer to a mistake that no amount of confidence or authority would be able to erase. The first certified letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday, folded so perfectly it almost looked ceremonial. I could smell damp paper mixed with fresh coffee as I opened it inside the cider barn, while rain tapped steadily against the metal roof. The Homeowners Association informed me that I was interfering with approved community recreational plans by restricting access to what they now described as shared neighborhood open space. I read the letter twice, mostly because I wanted to make sure I had not misunderstood it. According to Victoria, my refusal to allow unrestricted public access was negatively affecting property values and violating what she called the community development vision. The wording sounded official enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with property law, but every sentence carefully avoided one inconvenient fact. They never claimed to own the orchard. They simply repeated the assumption often enough that people eventually accepted it as truth. Over the next several weeks, the pressure became more public. Professionally designed banners appeared at the subdivision entrance announcing an upcoming autumn harvest celebration. Every advertisement featured photographs of my orchard without my permission. Families were encouraged to bring blankets, enjoy apple picking, and explore scenic walking trails that did not actually exist. One afternoon I drove past the neighborhood clubhouse and noticed a large display board covered with colorful renderings. Right in the center was an illustration of my orchard connected to the subdivision by decorative pathways and picnic areas. Victoria stood beside the display enthusiastically explaining the future improvements to a group of homeowners. She smiled warmly as she pointed toward my property, speaking with the confidence of someone unveiling a project already approved. Nobody questioned her because certainty can be remarkably persuasive when delivered with polished confidence. I parked across the street and quietly photographed everything from inside my truck. Every sign, every drawing, every brochure. Every smiling presentation became another page in a folder growing thicker by the week. The real turning point arrived the following Saturday morning. The sweet smell of cinnamon from fresh cider donuts drifted across the orchard as I prepared for our regular farm stand opening. Instead of customers arriving one family at a time, dozens of people began walking through the western entrance carrying folding chairs, picnic baskets, and reusable shopping bags. Several parents cheerfully told their children to pick any apples they wanted because the neighborhood festival had officially begun. They genuinely believed they had permission. I calmly explained that no event had been authorized and politely asked everyone to remain outside the fence until the misunderstanding could be resolved. Most families apologized immediately and left without complaint. They were embarrassed more than angry. Victoria, however, had been waiting for exactly that moment. She stepped forward wearing a bright white jacket with a Homeowners Association name badge clipped neatly to the front. A local reporter stood nearby holding a camera while another resident streamed the entire confrontation on social media. Victoria raised her voice just enough for every phone microphone to capture it. She accused me of intimidating residents, disrupting a scheduled community event, and unlawfully blocking access to neighborhood property. I never interrupted her. I simply listened while the breeze carried the scent of crushed apples across the gravel lane. Then she pulled out her phone, dialed the sheriff's office in full view of everyone, and calmly requested deputies respond to remove a trespasser from homeowners association property. As she ended the call, she looked directly at me with complete satisfaction, convinced the arriving deputies would finally establish her authority in front of the entire neighborhood. She had carefully staged the audience, invited the cameras, and rehearsed the narrative. The only thing she had forgotten to verify was who actually owned the ground beneath everyone's feet. The deputies listened without interrupting either of us. That alone frustrated Victoria because she clearly expected an immediate decision in her favor. Instead, the older deputy took a slow walk toward the weathered entrance sign, brushed a little dust from the carved letters with the palm of his hand, and quietly asked me one simple question. "How long has your family owned this place?" I answered honestly. "Since 1948. Victoria laughed before he could respond. "That is completely irrelevant. Ownership changed years ago during the subdivision expansion." She spoke with absolute certainty, the kind that comes from repeating the same story often enough to believe it yourself. I did not argue. I simply reached into the cab of my pickup and removed a thick waterproof binder that had been sitting behind the driver's seat for years. It was scratched, faded, and held together by reinforced corners, but inside were copies of every survey, every tax receipt, every recorded easement, every boundary adjustment, and every letter my father ever told me to preserve. I did not hand it to the deputy immediately. Instead, I placed it on the tailgate and waited. The breeze flipped one corner of the top page while the smell of fresh apples drifted between us. Victoria crossed her arms. "You cannot possibly think old paperwork changes anything." I smiled politely. "Maybe not, but county records usually do." The younger deputy glanced toward his partner, who nodded, slightly before opening the binder. Neither officer rushed. They examined the first survey, then another, comparing parcel numbers with the information displayed on the county map loaded into the computer inside their patrol vehicle. While they worked, the crowd behind the fence grew strangely quiet. Even the children who had been laughing only minutes earlier seemed to sense that something had shifted. Nobody picked another apple. Nobody unfolded another picnic chair. The only sound came from leaves rustling overhead and the distant hum of the refrigeration units inside my storage barn. Victoria stepped closer to the deputies, pointing toward one of the colorful brochures her association had distributed throughout the neighborhood. Everything residents received clearly identifies this as community property. The older deputy looked up without changing his expression. "Ma'am, brochures are not legal documents." For the first time that morning, I noticed a hint of uncertainty cross her face. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by another confident smile. She insisted there had to be updated filings, revised plats, or ownership transfers that would support her position. I quietly removed my phone and opened a folder containing photographs I had collected over the previous several months. There were pictures of survey stakes placed inside my orchard, advertisements describing private farmland as neighborhood amenities, newsletters announcing events without permission, and social media posts where Victoria repeatedly referred to the orchard as land controlled by the homeowners association. I offered the phone to the deputies without saying another word. The older deputy slowly scrolled through every image while his partner continued comparing parcel descriptions with the county database. Nearly 15 minutes passed before either officer spoke again. Those 15 minutes felt longer than the entire harvest season. Finally, the deputy closed the binder carefully and rested both hands on it. He looked directly at me first, then turned toward Victoria. "There is one record we need to verify with the county before anybody makes another claim about this. Property." Victoria answered with complete confidence that verification would prove everything she had been saying. I simply closed the binder because I already knew exactly which record he had found, and if the county archives still contained the original filing my father spent decades protecting, the next phone call was about to change far more than the ownership of an orchard. The deputy stepped away from the crowd and made a short call to the county records office. I could hear only fragments of the conversation carried by the breeze: parcel numbers, subdivision filings, archive plats, original conveyance documents. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted over from the neighboring lawns, while everyone waited in complete silence. Victoria stood with her hands confidently folded, occasionally glancing toward the homeowners gathered behind her as though she was already rehearsing a victory speech. I leaned against the tailgate of my truck and watched a pair of blue jays hop between the lower apple branches. My father always said that truth never became stronger because someone shouted louder. It simply waited until the right page was opened. Nearly 20 minutes later, another county vehicle rolled slowly into the orchard. Out stepped Harold Benson, the senior county surveyor, carrying a weathered leather tube almost identical to the one my father used to keep in our office. Harold had known my family for decades. He nodded politely to me before greeting the deputies. Victoria immediately walked toward him wearing the confident smile of someone expecting official confirmation. "Perfect timing," she said brightly. "You can finally explain that this property became part of Willow Ridge years ago." Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he carefully unrolled a large survey across the hood of one patrol vehicle. The thick paper crackled softly in the cool air. Faded ink lines stretched across the map, each parcel outlined with meticulous precision. Every boundary was marked by hand decades before satellite mapping ever became common. The deputies leaned closer while Harold pointed toward a series of recorded notes written along the western edge of the subdivision. "This is the original development plat filed before construction began," he explained calmly. "The homes were sold individually, the roads were dedicated, and the common facilities were transferred to the homeowners association." Victoria smiled and nodded repeatedly. "Exactly." Harold raised one finger without looking up. "But the underlying estate described in this reservation was never transferred." His fingertip rested on a narrow block of handwritten legal language running along the bottom margin. Even from several feet away, I recognized my grandfather's family name typed into the original filing. Harold continued. "The developer purchased construction rights through a long-term ground agreement. Ownership of the land itself remained with the Callaway estate under the recorded reservation filed with the county." The younger deputy frowned. "So the houses are privately owned, but the land underneath originated from this agreement?" Harold nodded. "Correct. Individual homeowners own their structures and their property interests exactly as recorded, but the original land reservation still exists because it was never extinguished or conveyed through a later filing." Victoria's smile disappeared so gradually that it almost looked unreal. "That cannot be right," she insisted. "Every resident received warranty documents." Harold answered with the patience of someone who had explained complicated land records for 30 years. "Warranty documents transfer exactly what the seller owns. They cannot transfer an interest that was legally reserved by someone else." I reached into the binder and quietly removed one yellowed photograph my father kept tucked inside the back cover. It showed my grandfather standing beside the developer in front of an unfinished field more than 2 decades earlier, both men shaking hands over the very agreement Harold was describing. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were my grandfather's words: "Never sell the roots if you want the orchard to survive." My father had saved that photograph not because it carried sentimental value, but because he believed one day someone would forget the difference between building on land and actually owning it. Standing there beneath rows of apple trees planted long before Willow Ridge existed, I realized that day had finally arrived. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after Harold finished explaining the reservation. The only sounds came from wind moving through the apple trees and the faint clicking of a flagpole outside the Willow Ridge clubhouse across the hill. Faces that had been filled with certainty only moments earlier now showed confusion. Homeowners quietly looked at one another, trying to reconcile years of confident HOA newsletters with the legal documents spread across the patrol car. Victoria finally broke the silence. She insisted there had to be another filing somewhere, another amendment, another agreement that superseded the reservation. Harold calmly invited her to point out the document if she had one. She opened a leather folder and began flipping through neatly organized papers, colorful community maps, board resolutions, maintenance contracts, architectural guidelines, and promotional brochures. One by one, she placed them on the hood beside the original county plat. Suddenly, every page looked surprisingly small next to a document that had been recorded decades earlier. The older deputy looked toward me. "Mr. Calloway, what exactly are you requesting today?" I answered carefully because this was never about embarrassing anyone. "I am requesting that my private property be respected, that unauthorized events stop immediately, and that the false claims about ownership be corrected." I paused before adding one more sentence. "I am not asking anyone to leave their homes." Several homeowners visibly relaxed after hearing those words. Relief spread through the crowd because many of them had clearly feared the worst. They had purchased their homes in good faith and were just as surprised as everyone else. My disagreement had never been with families raising children or retirees enjoying quiet streets. It had always been with people who believed confidence could replace documentation. Harold rolled the survey closed and looked toward Victoria. "You should have a real estate attorney review the original reservation before making any additional public ownership claims." The deputies agreed. They explained that this was fundamentally a civil property matter and that no evidence suggested I was trespassing on my own recorded land. The call that had been placed against me was officially closed. Victoria tried one final argument. She claimed the Homeowners Association had invested years maintaining landscaping around the subdivision entrance and therefore deserved continued access through the orchard. The older deputy answered with remarkable patience. "Maintenance does not automatically create ownership." Those words settled over the crowd with surprising weight. I reached into my binder one last time and removed several prepared envelopes that had been waiting there for months. My attorney had insisted I keep them ready in case informal conversations ever stopped working. I handed one sealed envelope to Victoria and another to the deputy for documentation. The letter formally demanded that the Homeowners Association cease representing the orchard as community property, remove all advertisements using photographs of the farm without permission, discontinue organizing events on private land, and preserve all board communications relating to ownership claims. Every request had been written weeks earlier because I had hoped it would never become necessary. Victoria accepted the envelope without opening it. For the first time since I had met her, she had nothing to say. The homeowners slowly folded their picnic blankets, gathered their baskets, and quietly walked back toward the subdivision. A few stopped to apologize before leaving. Others simply nodded with embarrassed expressions. I watched them disappear beyond the white fence while golden afternoon light settled across the orchard. My father had been right all along. You never won an argument about land by raising your voice. You won it by protecting the records long before anyone realized they would someday matter. The story spread through Willow Ridge faster than any official announcement ever could. By sunset, neighbors were standing in quiet circles at the clubhouse parking lot instead of discussing landscaping or holiday decorations. They were comparing copies of closing documents, asking questions nobody had thought to ask when they bought their homes years earlier. The smell of fresh mulch drifted across the entrance gardens while small groups studied county parcel maps on their phones with growing concern. Nobody blamed the families who had purchased homes honestly. Most of them had never heard the phrase ground reservation before that afternoon. They simply trusted the paperwork placed in front of them during closing. What unsettled everyone was discovering that the Homeowners Association Board had repeatedly described the orchard as community property without ever verifying the original county filings. 3 days later, my attorney called while I was repairing a section of irrigation pipe near the northern fence. The familiar scent of damp soil filled the air as cold well water splashed across my boots. He sounded calm, almost unsurprised. Several homeowners had already requested copies of the archived land records directly from the county. A special homeowners association meeting had been scheduled after dozens of residents demanded an explanation from the board. Nobody was accusing anyone of losing their homes. They wanted answers about why the association had made public ownership claims that were not supported by the recorded documents. The following week, Harold Benson invited representatives from the county planning office, the title company, and the Homeowners Association to review the complete historical file. I attended quietly with my attorney and the same weathered binder my father had left me. Every survey, reservation, amendment, tax record, and development filing was placed on a long conference table inside the county administration building. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that reminded me of courthouse archives and public libraries. For nearly 4 hours, the records were reviewed page by page. Every date matched. Every parcel number aligned. Every recorded reservation remained exactly where my father always said it would be. By the end of the meeting, even the title company representative acknowledged that the underlying reservation had remained part of the public record since the original subdivision approval. Within another week, Willow Ridge homeowners received an official notice from their board. Future newsletters, websites, promotional brochures, and community presentations would no longer describe the orchard as homeowners association property or imply public access rights that did not exist. Planned events scheduled on my land were canceled, and digital advertisements using photographs of the orchard were quietly removed. Victoria did not attend the next monthly board meeting. Rumors circulated that she had resigned, although I never cared enough to confirm every detail. Leadership changed. New volunteers joined the association, and the tone of neighborhood meetings reportedly became much less confrontational. A few days later, a small group of residents visited the orchard together. This time they arrived through the front gate after calling ahead. They purchased apples, cider, and homemade pies just like any other visitors. One elderly couple apologized for believing everything they had been told. I shook their hands and thanked them for coming. None of this had ever been about keeping good neighbors away. Respect worked both directions. As the last customers drove home that evening, the golden light settled across rows of apple trees exactly as it had for decades. Nothing about the orchard had changed. The only difference was that the truth was finally standing in the open, where everyone could see it as clearly as the boundary lines that had been there all along. 1 year later, harvest season arrived with the same familiar rhythm that had carried my family through generations. The orchard smelled of fresh apples, cool earth, and warm cinnamon drifting from the bakery beside the cider mill. Tractor tires crunched over the gravel roads before sunrise. Volunteers stacked wooden baskets beneath the packing shed, and children laughed as they searched for the brightest fruit hanging beneath branches my grandfather had planted with his own hands. Standing there in the early morning light, it was almost difficult to believe how close everything had come to changing because one person believed confidence carried more authority than recorded history. Willow Ridge looked different, too. Not because the houses had changed, but because the relationship between neighbors had. The new Homeowners Association board reached out before planning any event that involved land near the orchard. When they wanted to organize a charity harvest festival benefiting the local food bank, they asked instead of assuming. We sat around a picnic table with coffee, maps, and calendars, discussing parking, insurance, and safety, just as good neighbors should. I happily agreed. Hundreds of families visited that weekend. Children filled paper bags with apples. Veterans volunteered beside high school students. Local musicians played beneath the old oak tree where my father used to sharpen pruning tools. The orchard welcomed everyone because respect had finally replaced entitlement. One afternoon, while closing the farm stand, I noticed an elderly man studying the original entrance sign that still read Callaway Orchard. Established 1948. He smiled and said, "Funny how a few words on a piece of wood can outlast so many opinions." I smiled back because I knew it was never really the sign that had survived. It was the truth behind it. Before leaving, he purchased 2 gallons of cider and quietly added, "Your father would probably be proud." Those simple words stayed with me longer than any legal victory ever could. A few days later, I unlocked the old steel cabinet in my office and carefully returned every survey, deed, photograph, and handwritten note to the exact shelves where my father had always kept them. The worn binder rested beside them once again, its corners a little more faded than before, but its purpose finally fulfilled. As I closed the cabinet door, I remembered something my grandfather supposedly told my father many years before I was born. Land can feed a family for generations, but only if someone protects the story that comes with it. Trees grow because people care for them season after season. Rights survive because someone takes the time to preserve the records when nobody else thinks they matter. Outside, the afternoon sun settled across endless rows of apple trees, casting long shadows over the same soil my family had walked for more than 75 years. The breeze carried the gentle rustle of leaves through the orchard exactly as it had when I was a little boy riding beside my father in his old pickup. Nothing about that sound had changed. Neither had the boundaries. They had simply been forgotten by the wrong people for a little while. As I locked the gate for the evening, I glanced toward Willow Ridge one last time. Porch lights flickered on, families gathered for dinner, and life continued peacefully on both sides of the fence. That was always the outcome I wanted. Justice did not arrive with shouting, revenge, or humiliation. It arrived quietly inside county archives, preserved by patient hands decades before anyone realized those pages would matter. In the end, the loudest voice never decided who owned the land. The truth did. And the truth had been waiting in a dusty file cabinet all along.